Welcome to today's lesson on macroevolution and the origin of species. Here you can see the modern-day whale and how it has evolved over a very long period of time from ancient ancestors that actually used to walk on the land. Macroevolution occurs over geologic time and it's above the level of the species. Macro you want to think of as large or large scale. It's how new species evolve from ancient species. Last time we were looking at microevolution, which is how populations change over time. And we saw these moths evolving as species, evolving as populations to having different coloration based on which color blended in better with their background. Before we can discuss how new species form, so before we can discuss macroevolution, we have to decide upon what a species even is. Take a look at these two pictures. You have the African fish eagle and the bald eagle. Based on their similarities, you may assume that they are in the same species, but they are in fact separate species. If you look at this picture, you'll see two animals, two dogs that are very different from each other. They look super different, but they are actually members of the same species. So visible differences and similarities are not reliable for determining if two organisms are the same species or not. What are the rules? Here is the biological definition. A species is a group of organisms that can breed to produce fertile offspring together in nature, and they share a common gene pool. The key is that they reproduce, they interbreed, and that they produce offspring that can also reproduce. They're not sterile, they're fertile offspring. For a new species to arise, members must no longer reproduce with each other. They must be separate from each other in terms of their reproduction, and that's called reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation means just that. Organisms can no longer interbreed. So for new species to form, they must become reproductively isolated from each other so that they don't reproduce anymore. What is it that keeps different species separate and keeps them from reproducing with each other? There are prezygotic barriers and postzygotic barriers that keep species separate. Prezygotic barriers prevent members from different species from mating to even produce a zygote. And we're going to look at each of these examples one at a time. The first is called habitat isolation. Here we can see two insects that are separate species and remain separate because they prefer different habitats. This one prefers sandy soil, this one prefers loamy soil, so they never come close to each other so that they reproduce with each other. They are isolated, reproductively isolated because of habitat isolation. Here are two species that look super similar, but the thing is that the frog species on the left reproduces earlier in the year, so it's fertile earlier in the year, and this one reproduces later. Since they reproduce at different times, they are reproductively isolated. This is called temporal isolation. It has to deal with the timing of reproduction. Another form of reproductive isolation is behavioral isolation. Once again, two birds that look like they should be able to reproduce with each other, but they don't. It's the western meadowlark and the eastern meadowlark, and they have what is known as behavioral isolation. They have different courtship behaviors and mate preferences. So females of these species really are interested only in the mating calls of males of their own species. And since they have different mating calls, they don't interbreed with each other. So each female is only going to reproduce with the male that is singing the right song. And since they sing different songs, they don't mix with each other. They are isolated because of their behaviors. Here's a fun example of behavioral isolation. Some birds have really specific rituals that prevent them from breeding with other bird species. This is the blue-footed booby, which is very unique for its bright blue feet. And those feet are super important because in a courtship display, the male is going to high step and it's going to show off its feet to the female. And if the female likes his feet enough, she will agree to mate with him. This is such a specific ritual that there's a very slim chance that this bird or the female of this species is going to pick another species bird. There's no other species that exhibits this type of behavior. The fourth type of reproductive isolation is gametic isolation. This means that the egg and sperm are incompatible with each other. They just won't fertilize each other. Corals release their egg and sperm in mass all at the same time, many different species, but the sperm from one species cannot fertilize the egg from a different species. This is called gametic isolation. And the last type is called mechanical isolation. This reproductive isolating mechanism involves two species that have bodies or reproductive structures that don't fit together. In some snail species, the direction of the shell coiling actually prevents two different species from being able to interbreed. And what's happening here is that the genital opening of one species is mismatched with the genital opening of the other species, so they can't reproduce with each other. So on this picture, even though they look super similar, this species is different from this species because they cannot interbreed due to like their differences in location of their reproductive organs. Postzygotic barriers. So before it was prezygotic barriers. Those prevent the formation of a zygote. So reproduction never happens. Postzygotic barriers happen after reproduction. And basically, once a zygote is formed, that zygote might be inviable, so less likely to survive, or it might be sterile. So some hybrids don't survive embryonic development. Even though the egg and sperm get together, the embryo dies. Sometimes the embryo does survive, but the hybrids are less healthy and they have shorter lifespans, therefore less likelihood of reproducing. Here is the liger made from the tiger and the lion. And the liger has a shorter life and a lot of health problems that neither of its parents has. The other thing that happens post-zygotic barrier-wise is hybrid sterility. Many hybrids are sterile, meaning they can't reproduce. They might be super healthy, but they can't have young. And one example is when a female horse and a male donkey mate, they produce something called a mule. And mules are tough, they're smart, they're healthy, but they are completely sterile, so they cannot have offspring. That's a post-zygotic barrier that keeps horse and donkey species separate from each other. Okay, so how does speciation happen? Speciation is the process by which ancestral species split into two or more descendant species that are genetically different from one another and can no longer interbreed. Here you can see images showing you the modern day elephant and the speciation of the modern day elephant from ancient ancestors. There are two ways that speciation happens. The first is called allopatric speciation, and the second is called sympatric speciation. In allopatric speciation, speciation happens when a population becomes separated from the rest of the members of the population. So there's some kind of geographic separation, either by a mountain, a rock slide, or a river. Members of a species become separated. So here, for example, these two squirrel species are separated by a canyon. They became separated. Some are on this side, some are on that side. And they're evolving separately, not interbreeding with each other. And over time, this population evolves to be different from that population. And if the evolutionary changes are enough, they become separate species. And even if you did put them together, they wouldn't be able to interbreed anymore. This is this famous case of these two types of squares. Kaibab squares are found on the northern rim of the Grand Canyon. Kaibab squirrels became geographically isolated from Abert's squirrels, which are found in the southern rim of the canyon. In isolation, these squirrels evolved distinct characteristics such as a completely white tail. They're currently classified as a subspecies of Abert's squirrels, but they're on their way to becoming their own species due to allopatric speciation. So whenever there's a geographic separation, the two populations evolve independently, and over time they may become different enough so that they are now considered separate species. The other type of speciation is called sympatric speciation. In sympatric speciation, new species evolve even though they're in the same geographic region. So they're not separated by a river or a canyon or a mountain. They're in the same place at the same time. This is less common than allopatric speciation, but it does happen. Some members of a species may find a new niche. For example, all hawthorn flies used to lay eggs on hawthorn trees, and their larvae fed on hawthorn fruit. Then apples were introduced to the U.S. The U.S. didn't always have apples, but once the apples were introduced, some of the hawthorn flies began to lay eggs on apple trees instead and feed on apples. And they realized, like you and I realized, that apples are actually really delicious. Over time, the two populations evolved to breed at different times to match the season when the apple or the hawthorn fruits mature. So there was a split in the population of these flies, and some stuck to hawthorn fruit, and some of them stuck to the apple trees. And since hawthorn fruit and apple fruits mature at different times, they began to reproduce at different times, and they became reproductively isolated through temporal isolation and evolved into separate species. Here are these flies, right? Here's the hawthorn fruit, the apple fruit, and the species split so that some members of the species evolved to eat this hawthorn fruit and reproduce so that it's in line with when this fruit ripens, and the other part is adapted to eating the fruit of the apple tree and times its reproduction accordingly. Timing of macroevolution. So is evolution slow and steady? Does it happen all the time, or does it happen in rapid bursts? Actually, either might happen. The first theory is called gradualism. Gradualism says that evolution is slow and steady, and it occurs when geologic and climatic conditions are stable. So evolution can happen slowly and steadily if things are stable. Punctuated equilibrium is a form of evolution that involves periods of little change interrupted by bursts of rapid change. The bursts of rapid change occur when geologic and climatic conditions are changing. And here are examples. This is showing you gradualism. You can see the gradual evolution of this butterfly species or moth species into other species. And then this one is called punctuated equilibrium. So things kind of stay stable, and then there's a period of rapid change. Maybe the environment changed like it did with when we saw the moss with the dark background and the light background. Maybe the Industrial Revolution happens and the environment changes suddenly. That will speed up evolution, and then it'll stabilize again. So these are the two models for the timing of evolution. Thank you so much for listening.